Alright, I will say good morning. Today's daf is Nun Vav 56. We are going to pick up on the bottom of Nun Hey Amud Beis. We're picking up at Massive Rav Sheshes 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines up from the bottom. So remember again, just to reorient ourselves a little bit. So we saw ultimately the discussion of Rabbi Meir, or we saw the Mishnah, and then we saw Rabbi Meir came up with the idea, or the Gemara suggested Rabbi Meir's shita is that Chachamim asu chizuk lidivreim k'divrei Torah. That the Chazal, often when they legislate a law, they did so in a way that strengthened their positions as if they were the oraisa obligations. So remember again, this all came up because of the need to go ahead and add on an additional fifth when one consumes trumas meiser of demai, which is in and of itself a dirabanan, yet the idea that I have to add on a fifth indicates to us that lamaiser we're being machmir on a dirabanan. So massive Rav Sheshes. So Rav Sheshes brings up the following kasha. Mechalin also kesef al kesef. So we'll say this is talking about over here. This is, Rashi brings down Gabi Meiser Sheni Shel Demai. This is another case of Meiser Sheni of Demai. So the Gemara says over here, you could redeem silver on silver, Nechoshes on Nechoshes, copper on copper, Kesef on Nechoshes, silver coins, this is all coinage, silver coins onto copper coins, Unechoshes ala peros. And I will say Nechoshes ultimately again onto produce. So I will say this is actually an interesting case. This is all taking place outside of Yerushalayim. So what you're doing is you're transferring the Meiser Sheni sanctity multiple times. Now actually, we discussed this earlier about this machlokis, about how many times you can actually transfer Meiser Sheni sanctity. The Gemara over here is reflecting the idea that Lamais you could even do it multiple times. But again, this is not regular Meiser Sheni. This is Meiser Sheni of this is excuse me, I'm sorry, I keep saying Meiser Sheni. This is Meiser Sheni of Demai. Right? So again, this is treated a little bit more leniently than a regular case of Meiser Sheni. So the Gemara says, Meir says you could ultimately go ahead and be poda it again after you transfer the sanctity to multiple sets of coins. You could then go ahead and transfer it back into peros, and this is even outside of Yerushalayim. The Chum say Ya'alu peros v'yochlu b'Yerushalayim. The Chum say no. Yeah, once you go ahead and you transfer the sanctity back onto fruit, then Lamaisa again. Lamaisa, you take the fruit up to Yerushalayim and consume it there. Now ask the Gemara 1 second. Can you transfer sanctity from silver onto copper? But we learned let's listen to this interesting case. Let's say I have a seller of Meiser Sheni and of Chulin that got mixed up. Let's say seller is a silver coin. So I have a silver coin of Chulin and Meiser Sheni that got mixed with each other, and I don't know which one is which. So what do? Maybe seller maos v'omer kamakum sheshna seller shamais shin mechulel asal maos halalu. So what I do is I bring a ma'az worth of, so ma'az is a copper coin. So I bring a whole bunch of copper coins corresponding to the value of a silver coin, and I say that the Meiser Sheni should be redeemed ultimately on these copper coins. Uborer es hayafa shabai. And then I take the nicest of the two coins, meaning of the two coins that are mixed together, umechalalo alaha, and I transfer the sanctity from the copper coins back onto the silver coin, top of Nun Vav, lipnei sha'amru, because the rabbi said, mechalalin osal kesef al nechoshes midochak, that one is permitted to transfer sanctity, Meiser Sheni sanctity, from silver onto copper, midochak. Meaning midochak means in extenuating circumstances. This is not the lachatchila. This is not ultimately, again, what it is that we aspire to do, but in difficult circumstances you could do it. Lo sheikayim came. So remember again, we don't want you to maintain the Meiser Sheni money in the form of the copper coins. Rather, what I do is I go ahead and I take those copper coins and then I transfer their sanctity back onto a silver coin. And we'll say Rashi brings down the whole reason why I'm going through this convoluted process in terms of why not just transfer it right onto silver. Rashi, we're not going to get into that today. It's not for our discussion. The Gemara says, what is our discussion? Katani mihas mechalulin midochak. But we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that the Brisa says that you're permitted to transfer the sanctity of silver onto copper only midochak, only in extenuating circumstances. Midochak in, shelo midochak lo. We'll say you could do it in extenuating circumstances, but if it's not an extenuating circumstance, we don't want you to do it. We'll say, take a look at Rashi. Rashi katani mihas, right across. Gabi Meiser Vadai Midochak in Shalom Midochak Lo. Both say when it comes to Meiser Sheni Vadai, we do not want you ideally transferring sanctity from silver onto copper, unless of course it's an extenuating circumstance. V'cheivan da'amar kesef al nechoshes midochak in Shalom Midochak Lo. And we'll say, since it said that if you're going to go ahead and redeem silver onto copper, extenuating circumstances, you can do it. But if it's not, then you may not. The gabi d'mai tana mechal. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? There are two different cases. Rabbi brought down two cases. One was a case of transferring sanctity of Meiser Sheni of d'mai. One was a case of transferring sanctity of Meiser Sheni vadai. Definitive Meiser Sheni. And yet, what did you see? In the case of Meiser Sheni of d'mai, the Brisa Paskint, that one is permitted to transfer sanctity from silver to copper. And yet, in the case of Meiser Sheni Vadai, one said you could transfer from silver to copper, but only midochak, only from extenuating circumstances. So what do you see from here? You see from here that we don't treat D'Rabbanans the same way we treat D'Oraisas. Right? Because what's happening over here? We're more makel, we're more lenient by the D'Rabbanan than we are by the D'Oraisa. Because by D'mai, which is D'Rabbanan, we allow the transfer of Meiser Sheni sanctity from silver to copper. Yet, by Meiser Sheni Vadai, we only allow that in a case of dochak, in a case of extreme need. So which the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yosef, Afa Pishamek Rabbi Meir B'Yono, Machmirhu B'Achilaso. You're right. Even though Rabbi Meir is mekel, perhaps with the laws of redemption, and we'll say that in the case of Meiser Sheni of D'mai, which is D'Rabbanan, the laws of redemption will be more lenient, but he is machmir ultimately again with the laws of achila, and he will say that Meiser Sheni of D'mai ultimately again will have the same halachos as Meiser Sheni of Meiser Sheni Vadai, and that's why he paskins in the Mishnah that if one goes ahead and eats the Trumas Meiser of D'mai, one will have to go ahead and what? One will have to go ahead and pay an additional fifth. Okay, this Sanya, because we learned Lo hetiru limkar d'mai ela l'siton bilvad, was an interesting halacha. So Chazal only permitted you to go ahead and sell d'mai to a siton. So we'll say we will see a siton is a wholesaler. Look at Rashi. He says Lo hetiru limkar d'mai, lo hetiru l'chaver halokeach d'mai shimkrena lachem ad shi'aseh. So we'll say under normal circumstances, if I have d'mai in my possession, I am not permitted to sell it to another individual without first tithing it. Right? Remember again, d'mai is produce from an Ama Aretz. The whole big shaila is what has this produce been tithed or not? That's the fundamental shaila. And the halacha is I can't sell it to someone else until after I tithe it myself. There's an exception to this apparently, that when it comes to selling it to a wholesaler, I could sell my d'mai to a wholesaler without first tithing it. Rashi says over el siton bilvad, siton chaver lo hitzichu la'aser, ela mochro kishehu d'mai, v'alo chomimenu yafish masrosav, shakal yodin shasito mikama ame arz lokech. So also listen to this. So a wholesaler does not have to tithe his d'mai before he sells it to others. Why not? Because everyone knows that a wholesaler is getting his produce from multiple different sources, including presumably who? Amei haaretz. Therefore, whenever you buy from a seller, whenever you buy from a wholesaler, you always know that you have to tithe your produce. Therefore, if he has d'mai, he doesn't have to worry about selling it to others. So we'll say again, it's actually an interesting idea. So if I'm an individual and I'm selling, well, actually we'll see. Ubalabayis, I will say balabayis in this case over here, it doesn't mean like a regular case of balabas, but rather again, if Siton is a wholesaler, balabayis is a retailer. However, the retailer, benkach tzarech la'aseh Rabbi Meir. Both says, but Rabbi Meir holds that the balabayis, ultimately again, the retailer, he has to go ahead and tithe the produce before he goes ahead and sells it to anyone else. Rashi says over here, benkach, bein sheba lachsar v'lim karamida gasel chenvenim kesiton, bein sheba lachsar v'lim karamida daka chenvenim b'chanos pruta tzarach la'aser kodem sheimkor lefi shalokech menu savar sheme peros artzos. Here both say with the retailer, people don't know, or people could assume that the produce he's selling is whose? Is his own produce. And therefore, again, if he's known as a chaver, if he's known as a Talmid Chacham, he's known as someone who's makbid with Trumas and Meisros, people will assume that he tithed his produce. So both say this is Shitas Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir says that if a siton, if a wholesaler has dmai in his possession, he does not have to tithe it before selling it. Because since the nature of a wholesaler is that he's getting it from a bunch of different sources, people assume anything they buy from him is not tithed, and they will tithe it themselves. However, Balabayis, a retailer, people often assume that the produce he's selling is his own produce, which they're assuming he has tithe. Therefore, again, he cannot let demai pass through his hand. So,
is that halacha that when you buy from a wholesaler, you're automatically supposed to assume that?
Oh, so we're it's machlokas. The chum say is another tzad. So chum say echad asiton ve'echad balabais mochar v'sholeach lechavero v'nosim matana v'nachoshish. The chum on the other hand say that no, whether a person is a wholesaler or whether a person is a retailer, so the halacha is mochar v'sholeach v'nosim lechavero. You could sell it, you could send it to your friend, you could give it to him as a gift. Ve'eno choshesh. Ve'eno choshesh. We'll say ve'eno choshesh means in this context that in all cases when you buy produce from people who sell it, you always have to assume that it is untithed. Shidas Chachamim. Doesn't matter wholesale or retailer, you always have to assume that Shumas and Maestros have not been taken. Look at Rashi. Ve'cham necham om sito echad sito ve'echad balabayis sheba limkar b'mida gasa kederach hamashbiyin or kederach hasitonos mocher v'sholeach lechavero shechazaka kol amochrim v'nostin b'mida gasa v'cheska shlo isru d'mai heim. So we'll say, so Chum say no. The Chum say that look, anybody who deals in commerce, right? They're not taking the steps to tithe produce. So whether you're buying from a reseller, essentially we'll say, according to the Chachamim, the fundamental issue is if somebody's selling for profit, right? If somebody's in this for profit, then l'maisa again you cannot assume they tithe, and therefore when you buy that, the obligation of tithing is upon you. That's the machlokas. Masir Rabino, Shabin raises a kasha, halokech min anachto ma'asa min acham al tzonen. I suppose another interesting case. Somebody goes in and buys from a baker. So what happens? I buy a bunch of loaves of bread from a baker. So what happens? Halokech min anachtum ma'asra min acham al tzonen. So we'll say I can go ahead and what? Remove the meiser or whether it's meiser or challah from the hot loaves or the warm loaves on the cold loaves. Or from the cold loaves on the warm loaves. Even if the loaves came from multiple different molds. In other words, so you understand means like the way they often made loaves is you put it into a, you could do this like when you make challah. There are two different ways you can make challah. You can mamish braid the dough, or you could buy like these molds that essentially you put the dough in, and it puts like it just makes it look like the top is braided, but it's not really braided.
Pull apart.
I'm sorry?
Pull apart challahs.
Pull apart challahs? No, I'm saying, this is like a loaf. It's a loaf. It just has like an image on top, like a press. Yeah. Okay, good. Whatever. The point is, all right, I didn't mean to open about right? The point is over here that the loaves are different. That's the point over here. So I have multiple different types of loaves, some hot, some cold, and they look different. They look different as well. So the halacha is, I could go ahead and tithe one from the other. In other words, I don't have to go ahead and separate out the tithes from the loaves that look the same. I could even designate certain loaves that look one way on loaves that look a different way. So these are the words of Rabbi Meir. Bishlama minatzonenes alachama kid Rabbi Eloi. So I understand why I can go ahead and separate out cold loaves on warm loaves. I was using cold loaves, warm loaves. So the distinction is fresh bread versus not fresh bread. So I understand why I'm allowed to do that. Even though Rabbi say what? The quality of the two items is dramatically dissimilar, yet I'm still allowed to go ahead. So what this means over here is, if I have the batch of warm bread, I want to go ahead and separate out one of yesterday's loaves as a tithe for that. I could do that. So why do I know that? Because Rabbi Eloi, Dam Rabbi Eloi, minay l'torah min hara ala yafesh truma truma. But say, how do I know that if you go ahead and what? If you separate out bad produce on good produce, that it is a valid designation of truma. Shneimar v'lo tisu alav chet b'harimchem es chalbo mimenu. Because the pasuk says, you shall not bear a sin when you separate its chelev when you separate the chelev from it. I will say, this is talking about separating out inferior tithes. Im eino kadosh Nesias Chet Lamas. We'll say it's interesting. So essentially what the Torah says is the following. Do not go ahead and bear a sin when you separate out the chelif from it. So the idea over here is, what the Torah is telling me is, don't do it, but if you do it, it works. In other words, ideally, it is best not to separate out inferior produce as truma, but if you separated out inferior produce as truma, such a separation and such a designation, in fact, is halachically binding. Ella afilu midefusim harbe lechosh dilma asila frushim min achiv ala pater or min apater ala chiv. But here's the bigger problem. The bigger problem you have is if you're telling. So I understand then why I could separate out old loaves as truma or as meiser for new loaves. That I understand, for fresh loaves. Because I have a concept that I could separate out inferior produce as truma and meiser for superior produce. I got it. However, what about the case of the different types of molds? The breads look different. And I could separate out trumas and meisers from one batch on another batch that looks dramatically different. Leichosh dilma asi la'afrushe min achiyuv ala pater or min apater ala chiyuv. We'll say, do I not have a concern in that type of case? That's what? That I may come to separate out things that are required in trumas and meisers from things that have already been tied. In other words, when you're dealing with two dissimilar batches, are we not concerned that you may come to separate out something that has already been tied as something that has not yet been tied? So Amar Abaye, so the Gemara says, Amar Abaye, Rebbe Lazar, Shapir Kakashile. So Rebbe says Abaye, Rebbe Lazar asked the good question. Rebbe said, now we're jumping back for just a moment. Abaye said that Rebbe Lazar, when he went ahead and he asked earlier, then Rebbe Lazar went ahead and asked the question, which was the beginning of the Gemara in yesterday's daf, that did the rabbis really strengthen their halachos, like Doraisos? That was a good question. And Shmuel lo shapir kameshanile. But Shmuel's answer was not a good one. So once again, remember, let's go back for just a moment. What was Rebbe Lazar's kasha? Rebbe Lazar's kasha was that the Mishnah said that if you ate Shumas Meiser of Demai, you have to pay not only back the principal, but what? The additional fifth. Rebbe Lazar says, I don't understand that. Consumption of Shumas Meiser of Demai is a rabbinic prohibition. The fifth penalty is on Doraisas. Is it true that the Chachamim are going ahead and treating their Isurim like Doraisas? So Rabbi Lazar asked that question, and Shmuel answered it. How did Shmuel answer it? Shmuel said, the Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Meir. Because what does Rabbi Meir say? And then Rabbi remember again, the Gemara quoted the case of Befanei Nechtav or Befanei Nechtam. Right? And Rabbi Meir is the one who said that if you deliver to get to a woman, she delivered to get to a woman, and didn't say Befanei Nechtav, Befanei Nechtam, and then what, she gets remarried and she has kids, what's the halacha? Right? She has to leave the second marriage and the children are mamzerim. So you see from here that Rabbi Meir holds that Rabbanans are vested with the same level of intensity as Daraisas. So the Gemara says over here, Rabbi Lazar asked a good kasha. Shmuel did not answer appropriately. Why? Tikashile Rabbi Lazar misa dibidei shamayim. Because I will say, Rabbi Lazar ultimately again was bringing a kasha based on Misa V'dei Shamayim. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. The kasha le Rabbi Lazar, v'chi asu chizuk b'shumas meiser shal demai shikala, ashafilu shuma vados einu ela b'misa b'dei shamayim zar ochla. But listen to this. So, Rabbi Lazar's question is predicated on the following idea: if a non-Kohen eats, if a non-Kohen eats truma vadai, non-Kohen eats regular truma, the halacha is, that is misa b'dei shamayim, death at the hands of heaven. Now, in Rabbi Lazar's worldview, that is a more mekel, that is a more lenient form of a death penalty, which makes sense because, again, anything that's b'dei shamayim, a person has the ability to work out with the Ribono Shel Olam through tshuva. So Rabbi Lazar's kasha was the following. Rabbi Lazar's kasha was, even if you were to eat truma vadai, you would only, quote unquote, bichai misa b'dei shamayim, which tells you that even truma vadai is more kal. How could it then be that in a drabanan of truma, in a drabanan, meaning demai, where you consume the trumas meiser of demai, you're going to have to pay the principal plus a fifth? It doesn't make sense. Or Meshayna the Shmuel, and Shmuel went ahead and answered him with the case of Misas Bezdin. Shmuel answered him with the case of Abosai. Now, what's the case of Misas Bezdin? The case of Misas Bezdin Abosai is the get case. Why? Because if it turns out that a woman commits adultery, that infraction is subject to Misas Bezdin. Obviously, that case is not subject to Misas Beis Din, because, bless you, because she thought she was divorced, right? She's of course not actually liable to Misa Chas Shalom in that case. What it's saying is that type of behavior, i.e. adultery, is subject to Misas Beis Din. To which the Gemara says, Dilma Shani Misas Beis Din, Dechamira. Maybe the case of get is fundamentally different, because since the prohibition of adultery is subject to death at the hands of a human court, that's why it's treated more machmir. For Rav Sheshes, lo shapir kamosivle. And Rav Sheshes, furthermore, also did not give a proper answer. Because we'll say, remember again, what did Rav Sheshes say? Rashi says, for Rav Sheshes, the osei l'shmua mechilul shelo asu bo chizok bechilul shal demai. Rav Sheshes was the one who brought up the case. Ultimately, again, who contrasted the redemption of Meiser Sheni of Demai with Meiser Sheni Vadai. Meiser Sheni Vadai, you can't transfer sanctity from silver to gold. Meiser Sheni from Demai, or at least you can only do it b'tchak. Meiser Sheni of Demai, you can do it. So furthermore, again, the Gemara says, and Rav Sheshes didn't give a good answer either. Why? Tika Amri Inhu Misa Umosiv Rav Sheshes Lav. Because of both sides, the other cases that the other Rabban are bringing up are cases where there's a potential punishment of Misa. And Rav Sheshes brings up a case of Lav. Dichsiv, because it says by Meiser Sheni, Lo Suchal Le'echol B'Sharecha. The pasuk simply says you're not permitted to eat it in your gates. Ulamai demosiv Rav Sheshes, Ulamai demosiv Rav Sheshes, and that which Rav Sheshes answered, Rav Yosef Shaper Kamishanile. So therefore, in that version, Rav Yosef's answer is also appropriate. Ever Ravina ad demosiv minachtum l'seile mipalter. But if that's the case, Rabbi say Ravina, when he brings a kasha from the case of nachtum, from the case of the baker, the loaves that we just had before, let it bring a raya from the case of the palter. Rabbi say, what's the case of the palter? Rashi says over here, palter hu le'inyan kikaros kesiton le'inyan tivua lokeach. So we'll say, so essentially a palter we're going to see is kind of like a wholesaler of bread. He says this nan halakach min palter. If somebody purchases bread from a palter, so we'll say, so again, palter essentially is also a wholesaler. So what's the halacha? Ma'asra min kol defus udefus Meir. Meir says you have to separate, you have to tithe each type on its own. Ela ma'is lechalamemar palter mitrei tlasa gavri zabin. So we'll say the idea over here is because we know, going back to our Seton case, a palter purchases from a bunch of different people. So because of that, again, you must assume that's what? That he has not tithed anything. Therefore, again, nachtum naim echad gavru zabin. So I'll say, so too we would say that the nachtum only purchases from one individual. To which the Gemara says, Rava Amar Shmuel, Shaper Kameshaneve, Shem Misa Ba'olam. So also ultimately again, Rava says that Shmuel, going back, Shmuel actually answered the question well, because Shmuel was saying Shem Misa Ba'olam means that we could compare the different cases. We can compare a case of ultimately Misa B'dei Adam, which was the case of the get, to the case of Misa B'dei Shemaim, which would be the case of Truma. Why? Because ultimately, again, it's all called Misa. Therefore, I will say, just coming kind of full circle in all of this, the way the Gemara seems to end off is that Lamaisa, again, the case of the Trumas Meiser of Demai that would be Chayev Chomesh, even though it's a Derabanan, would in fact reflect the view of Rabbi Meir, who holds Asu Chachamim Chizuk L'Divrei Keshal Torah, that in certain circumstances, not all circumstances, Chazal went ahead and bolstered their positions with almost the intensity and severity of biblical law, and that's why, again, even in a case when a person consumes Shumas Meiser of Demai, which is only Derabanan, one will be obligated to go ahead and pay the additional fifth. Good, says the Mishnah. But let's see, now we go weiter, come to another interesting case. Elu Dvarim She'en Lahem Onah. I will say the following is a list of things that are not subject to the laws of Onah. What are they? Not subject to the laws of overcharging. What are they? Ha'avadim, slaves. Shtaros, documents. Karkaos, land. Hekdeshos, Hekdesh. What's right? All of these cases. Rashi says over here, what's the case of Hekdeshos? Rashi says, Gizbar, first of all, Shtaros, Rashi says, is Hamocha Shtaros Ligvos Chov Shabasocha V'Yitleno La'atzmo. So I'm selling a note. There's no ona'ah by the selling of a note. We'll discuss why that is. Hekdeshos, Rashi says over here, Gizbar Hamocha Hekdesh or Hamocha Alot Shnafa Balmum. If I am the Gizbar, the temple treasurer, and I am selling something that belongs to the Beis HaMikdash because the Beis HaMikdash no longer needs it, there is no ona in that transaction. It goes on. Furthermore, Elam tashlumi kefel. These items also are not subject to the laws of kefel, which are both sides the double payment if you're found out to be a thief. Nor are they subject to the laws of arba v'chamisha. So we'll say arba v'chamisha is the case of tavach u'machar. Obviously, some of these situations are not shaykh to it because they're not shaykh to it. But arba v'chamisha means, remember, if you steal a cow or a sheep, the halacha is if you slaughter it and sell it, you are chayiv 4 or 5 times penalty payment. Shomer chinam elam mishpah. Shomer chinam does not have to swear. Look at the last Rashi. Last line. A shomer chinam is not obligated to swear that he was not negligent with a particular item in his care. And a shomer sachar does not have to pay if it was stolen from him. Again, as we'll say, we'll discuss the parameters of these statements. Rabbi Shimon says on the base, we'll say any sacrificial item that you are responsible for is subject to the laws of ona. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Amar kajim shechai bach. What's an example of kajim for which you are chayiv, which you are responsible for? Amar harei alai ola ve'frisha v'chomama umachra. But listen to this. If a person says, I hereby take upon myself responsibility to bring an ola. If something happens to that animal, what's the halacha? Right? I am obligated to replace it. So we'll say any case where I am obligated to replace it, ultimately, again, it is subject to the laws of ona. But any case where I would not be chayiv b'achrayis. So we'll say, so as an example, in a case where I would not be chayiv b'achrayis for a carbon, I go over to an animal, I say, harei zu ola. This animal is an ola. So we'll say, something happens to that animal, what's the halacha? I'm done. You hear the distinction? If I take the responsibility upon myself, then I am obligated until I bring that an animal to the Beis Hamikdash. If I say this animal, so that's the animal that's chayiv. If something happens to it, ultimately again, I'm potter. However, so the Gemara goes weiter. Rabbi Yehuda says, Af hamocher sefer Torah behema umargelis ein lahen onar. Yehuda says even someone who sells a sefer Torah, someone who sells an animal, or someone who sells a precious jewel is also not subject to the laws of onah. Amrulo, they said to him, Lo amru ella es elu. So they responded back to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, sorry, the list is closed. Right? The list is only the list we said at the beginning of the Mishnah, and you cannot add on these additional items. Says the Gemara, Min Hani Mili. So we'll say, now we're going to go through the list. So the Mishnah included a list of things that are not subject to the laws of Onah. So ask the Gemara, how do I know that these things that you mentioned are not subject to Onah? Oh, I'm going to show you. Titan Rabbanon, V'chisim kuru mimkar lamisecha. O kano miyad amisecha. So also remember the pasuk by Onah says, if you will sell an item to your friend, or you will acquire something from the hand of your friend. So the Gemara dashes, why does it say okano? We could have just said okano mamisecha. The same way it says, v'chisimkuru mimkar lamisecha. Let it say okano miamisecha. Why does it say miyad from the hand? The Gemara dashes, Davra hanikna miyad liad. To teach us that the only things that are subject from na'a are what? Something that could be conveyed from hand to hand. Which also is another way of saying what? Metaltalin. Movable property. Only movable property is shaykh to ona. Yotzu karkos she'ina metaltalin. Therefore, Rabosai comes to exclude karka. That real estate is not subject to the laws of ona. Yotzu avadim. Rabosai, which by the way also you understand. So, we're learning that from Daraisa, but real estate is probably the one thing that can't be shaykh to ona, because real estate has so many other secondary, valuation metrics, right? There are different reasons why real estate is important to different people. But in any event, but midaraisa, because metaltalin is exempt from ona. Yatsu avadim, so ultimately again it excludes avadim from ona. Why? Shok shulakarkos. Because ultimately, again, avadim, slaves, are compared to karka. Yatu shtaros. So we'll say it excludes shtaros. Why? Because we'll say what is subject to ona? Only something that is a mimkar, that is a sale. Shegufa machar. Only something whose essence, whose guf, the body itself, the object itself can be sold. V'gufa kanoi. And the object itself can be acquired. Yatsu shtaros she'in gufan machar. So we've discussed this before. A note has no inherent value. You see, if I lent Reuven $1,000 and I sell you that note, that note, that piece of paper that I'm giving you, represents an opportunity or an entitlement to collect. But the note itself is it's a piece of paper. It's not considered to be an object of mammon. So because it's not considered to have an inherent value, and because it's not something that can be inherently acquired, therefore again, and it's really only there, I will say, as a proof that I am the person who could collect the note. Therefore again, mikan amru, so we'll say, therefore alocha l'maisa, it's not subject to the laws of Ona. But listen to this. Mikan amru, hamochesh tarosav levasam, yesh la'ona. We'll say, we learn from here that what? If you sell your notes to basam is like a spice salesman, there is Ona. We'll say, what does that mean? If I sell my notes to the spice salesman, so that why does the spice salesman want to buy my notes? He wants to buy my notes because they both say, when he sells his spices, he needs something to go ahead and roll the spices up in order to convey it. So if I sell my note to a spice salesman, that's another way of saying what? I'm selling him my notes for use as paper. Oh, once he's using it as paper, now suddenly what? It has value. Once it has value, technically speaking, again, it could be subject to the laws of Omna. So the Gemara says, Pshita. So the Gemara says, Pshita. Is that not obvious? To which the Gemara says, well, say, obviously, if you're selling the paper, if you're selling the notes as paper, then what? Then now you're selling an actual object. And if you're selling an actual object, then of course it's subject to the laws of Ona. What's the Chiddush? La'afukim ed Rav Kahana. It will say it comes to exclude the position of Rav Kahana. The Amr ein Ona al Prutos. We'll see yesterday's daf as well. Rav Kahana says that they both say there is no Ona for Prutos. Rather, the shir of Ona must be measured in at least an Isser. At least an Isser, not a Pruta. Kamashmal and Yeshon al Prutos. Therefore, this Gemara teaches me that no, there is Ona even for a small amount like a Pruta. Hekdeshos. So what about Hekdish? Why isn't Hekdish subject to the laws of Ona? Amar Kra, because the pasuk says Ochiv. The pasuk ultimately says what the Bosai. The pasuk says Okano altono ish es Ochiv. Do not charge Ona to your brother. Ochiv below Hekdish. Bosai dafka to my brother and not to Hekdish. Maskif la bar mamol. So let's go back for just a moment. So the way this whole discussion began is that we said that both karka is not shaykh to Ona. Why? Because the pasuk says okano miyad amisecha, only something that could be acquired from the hand of your fellow subject to Ona. So literally what we're saying is literally hand, metaltalin, but not karka. So which the Gemara says, Rabbi Baramal says, is that to say that every single time the Torah says yado means yado mamish? In other words, that yado means literally something that you could acquire from your friend's hand. So the Gemara says, Ela me'ato dichsiv vayikach es kol artso miyado. But yet the pasuk says, right? Ki cheshbon irsoch sichon melech ha'amorihi v'hu nilcham melech mavarishon vayikach es kol. So also the pasuk says that Sichon took the land of Melech Moab, and it says Vayikach es kol artso miyado. Does that literally mean Hachanami dechol are biyadi havinakitla? Does that literally mean that Sichon took the land of the king of Moab in his hand? Of course not. Ella mirishuso. Rather, I will say perhaps yado can mean what? Perhaps yado can mean rishuso. Hachanami mirishuso. So to Rabbi say by ona, maybe it also means rishuso, and maybe what it means is any transaction where an item is transferred from one rishus to another is subject to the laws of ona. In which case, if that's your understanding of the pasuk, then what Rabbi say, then even land should be subject to the laws of ona. To which the Gemara says, 1 second, v'chol heicha d'chsev yado. Lav yado mamashim. Is that true? In other words, the Gemara is backtracking. With the Gemara, I don't know. I still think that whenever the pasuk says yado could literally mean his hand. After all, V'hatanya we learned imimatze timatze biyado. The pasuk says also by theft. If the stolen item will be found in the hand of the ganav, Eini ela yado. I only know if the ganav is chai for kefel. If you find it in his hand, gago chatzer the karpifo minayin. How do I know that if I even go ahead and find it in his rishus, right, on his rooftop, in his chotzer, in his karfeif, that he's also chayiv tam lomar im himatze timatze mikol makom. Because it also the double lashon of himatze timatze tells me that wherever you find it. What do you see from here? Time of the because of rachmanim himatze timatze halav hachi hava amina kol hecha the because of yado mamishu. We'll say, so what do you see from here? It's only because of the double lashon of himatze timatze that we come to include other places. That we come to include the fact that what? Wherever you find wherever you find this item, ultimately, again, the ganav will be chayav. But what do you see from here? That just the word yado by itself means what? The word yado by itself literally means hand. Visu tanya. Furthermore, we learn v'nasan biyada. Well, sorry, it says by get, you shall put the get in her hand. Ili eli yada. I only know that you have to deliver the get into her hand. Gaga, chatzera, the karfifa minayin. How do I know that I could even deliver it into other areas of her rishus? Ta'ulomar v'nasan mikol makom. Because the pasuk says v'nasan. Time with the kasher achman v'nasan. The only reason I will say why I know that I could place it in other areas other than her hand is because the pasuk says v'nasan halavach. He had the pasuk not said that hava mina kol echad dikasav yado mamish. But had it not said that, I would have assumed that's what. Anytime the Torah says yado means what? Mamish hand. Ella kol yado mamish. I think Gemara says you're right. We're going back to what we originally thought. When the Torah says yad means yad, and therefore Rabosai by Onah, when the Torah says okano miyad amitecha, the Torah is coming to teach you that it's only something that could be handed over from one person's hand to the other person's hand that is subject to Onah, i.e., only metalton are subject to Onah. And what? And I both say the pasuk from Bamidbar that Sichon took Sichon took the lands of the king of Moab in his hand. Says v'shayni hasam delek kalamei elamei rashusa. And I will say obviously it goes without saying the pasuk in Bamidbar is an expression that when Sichon took the land of the king of Moab in his hand, of course it's not literal. There is to be understood. There yado means rashuso, but under other circumstances yado normally means yado, and therefore again the limud that teaches us that Onah does not apply to karka still remains in place. Boy Rabbi Zera. So Rabbi Zera has an interesting kasha. It's a fascinating question over here. Up until now, we've always been dealing with Onah in the context of a sale. Now the Shai the Gemara wants to ask, what about rentals? Are rentals subject to the laws of Onah or not? So the Gemara says, well, let's analyze this. On one hand, the Torah says explicitly v'chisimkaru. The Torah is talking about a memkar, talking about a sale. So on one hand, the Torah says that it is a sale that is subject to the laws of Onah, but not a rental. Odilma loshna. Or perhaps you do not make a distinction between what? Between a sale and between a rental. To which the Gemara says, Abaye, miksiv mimkar olam, mimkar stamaksiv. So we'll say, when Torah doesn't speak about an eternal sale, but rather again it just says sale. V'hai nami biyomei mechirin. I'll say here the Gemara makes a fascinating statement. The Gemara says, you know what the status of a rental is? Well, during the duration of the rental, that's the equivalent of a sale. So the which we're going to discuss this in greater depth, but this is a fascinating idea. So the Gemara is suggesting is, essentially the definition of a rental is a sale with an expiration date, right? Sale with an expiration date. Therefore, again, perhaps as long as during the duration of the rental, it's called a memkar. And therefore, again, it is subject to the laws of Onah. So let's say, here's the fundamental shaila. Is a rental subject to the laws of Onah? And essentially, again, it depends how we're understanding a rental. Is a rental a beria b'fnei atzma, essentially its own legal entity, or is a rental considered to be a sale with a beginning date and an end date? So the Gemara says the following. Let's analyze this. Fine. By Rabin, so we'll say, so Rabin asked the following kasha. So we'll say another we're building on the previous question. Chitin v'zarn b'karka mahu. We'll say, what happens if you take wheat seeds, and you sow them, you plant them in the ground? You plant them in the ground. So what's the halacha? Yesh lahen onah, o ein lahen onah. So we'll say, so are the sale of the seeds, subject to onah, not subject to onah? So the Gemara says, kiman d'shadjan b'kadyo damyon. Do you say it's as if now we'll define what this case is in just a moment. It's as if you put the seeds in a jug, v'yesh lahen onah, and therefore I will say the seeds are considered to be metaltalin, and therefore are subject to onah. O dilma batlinu agav karka. So we're talking about over here, what kind of seeds? Seeds that have not yet taken root. So what's the status of seeds that have not taken root? Are seeds that have not taken root like seeds that have been placed in a jug, i.e. metaltalin, and therefore subject to onah? Or do we say no? Once you put it in the ground, what? It's bottled to the ground. And once it's bottled to the ground, again, it's no longer subject to the laws of onah. So it says, well, what's the case? Hey, Yomi. So we'll say, what's the case? If it's a case where the seller is saying, look, I went ahead and I put 6 sa'ah of seeds into the ground. And he sells it to Ruvain. And then witnesses come along and say, no, the seller didn't put 6 sa'ah, rather he only put 5 sa'ah of seeds into the ground. So we'll say, is that the case you're talking about? That can't be why. It was very important. Rava said, Kol davar shebemidav shebamishkav shebaminyan, afilu pachos mikadei onah chozer. But listen to this. Whenever you are selling a quantifiable amount, and it turns out that the amount that the seller said he was selling you is not the amount that he actually sold you, and we'll say, that is not onah. What is that called? What is that called? Right, fraud, right? It's called a mekachtos, right? I will say, again, that's something totally different. That's not onah. That's over here. You told me you were selling me 6 sa'ah. You only sold me 5 sa'ah. That's not onah. That's fraud. That's mekachtos. I will say, very important distinction. Onah is when there's a change, when there's a deviation in the price. But the agreed upon merchandise has been delivered. If the agreed upon merchandise has not been delivered, then that's a mekachtos. Ella, the amar ihu shadai baki deboila. Rather, we'll say, what's the case? The case over here is where the person who's selling the produce, or the person who's selling the future produce, says, listen, I sowed this field with the requisite amount of seed. V'igoli milsa de lo shada baki deboy. And then it turns out that he didn't. Yesh lanona, o ein lo hanona. Ultimately, again, is that transaction subject to ona or not? So, kiman deshadi bekado damyon ve'yesh lana. So, we'll say, is it like, meaning, how do we view the seeds before they've taken root? Do we view them as if they're sitting in a receptacle, and therefore, again, they're metalton subject to ona? Or, odilma batlinu agav karko, agav ara? Or do we say that since they've been put in the ground, then what? They are batal to the ground. Nishba'in alehen. O ein nishba'in alehen. So we'll say another interesting kasha. Would, look at Rashi, nishba'in alehem, im hoda b'miktsas, kigon tanu piskas ame lizroa vav, shem asarti l'cha, v'zarata chameshu, omer zarati chameshu mechza. So we'll say again, let's say you were to have a moda b'miktsas case over here, right? Would this type of case be subject to moda b'miktsas? So we'll say again, what does it depend? It's all the same question. The fundamental question is, what's the status of seeds before they've taken root? Are they considered to be like metaltalin? Or are they considered to be like karka? And again, these are all the nafkaminas. If you have a moda b'miktsas case, so we'll say moda b'miktsas does not apply to karka, only applies to metaltalin. So again, kiman d'shadjan b'kada damyon v'nishpan alehen. Is it as if they're in a jug, and therefore again the metaltalin, they regenerate an obligation for shvuah? O dilma batlinu agav ara ve'in nishba'in alehem. Or both say, are they considered to be bottled to the ground? And ultimately, again, you would not take a shvuah on them. Next question. Omer matiran, no, ain't Omer matiran. So we'll say ultimately again, and we'll stop over here with this, we'll pick up with this tomorrow, is the bringing of the Omer, does that matter them or not matter them? So we'll say, we'll stop, actually I'm going to stop over here, so I'm kind of leaving you mid-question. But the question I'm leaving you with, and I promise you we will answer it tomorrow, Mir Hashem, first thing tomorrow morning, is the status of seeds planted in the ground ultimately again, before they take root. Right? Are they considered to be like metaltalin or like karka? So far we're seeing a whole bunch of nafkaminas. Nafkamina number one is it subject to ona? If it's like karka, no. If it's like metaltalin, yes. Number two, is it subject to moda b'miktsas? If it's like karka, no. If it's like metaltalin, next. And now the third question, which we'll further develop tomorrow, is what's the impact of the carbon ha'omer on these seeds? Does the carbon ha'omer matter these seeds if they're part of the karka, or does it have no impact on them if they're metaltalin? But we'll pick up with the omer case Mir Hashem tomorrow. Shkach